There's a chapter of human history that almost no one talks about. A war without a name. A catastrophe without a monument. Around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, something happened. Something that forever altered the future of humanity. The evidence isn't buried in ruins or written in crumbling texts. It's written in our genes. It's written in the silent gaps where ancestors should have been. At some point, between 3,000 and 5,000 BCE, up to 90% of male lineages were wiped from the human family tree. Almost overnight, genetically speaking, nearly all men disappeared. It's scary as hell to see that nothing really indicates why this happened, at least nothing very specific. During a time when nothing was really recorded in books, or even rocks, there's no trace left, no mention of anything. We know of it mostly thanks to our technological advances in genetics, and thanks to hints on burial sites across the world. This is the story of the prehistoric war that erased most men, and why it still matters today. Chapter 1. A World on the Brink. To understand how this all started, we need to look at the world 7,000 years ago. Human societies were changing. Fast. For thousands of years, life had followed a predictable rhythm. Small bands of hunter-gatherers moved with the seasons, hunted what they could, gathered what they found. Conflict was personal, intimate and sea, and usually small scale. A dispute over territory, a stolen animal, a grudge. But then, everything accelerated. The period between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE, the tail end of the Neolithic and the dawn of the Bronze Age, marked a profound transformation across Europe, the Near East, and Central Asia. This was the age when metallurgy began to emerge. In many areas, stone tools were giving way to copper blades. Societies began to experiment with mining, smelting, and trade networks that stretched hundreds of kilometers. As detailed in Anthony's The Horse, The Wheel, and Language, 2007, these early innovations helped lay the groundwork for the great steppe cultures that followed. It was also the time when cultures like the funnel beaker, lengyel, globular amphora, and eventually the corded ware and bell beaker began to rise, spreading innovations and identities across the continent. In the Near East, cities like Uruk in Mesopotamia were taking shape, forming the first urban centers in human history. The very first writing systems were still in their embryonic stages, etched into clay tablets by temple accountants. This urbanization process is well documented in 2005 studies like Algae's Current Anthropology, showing how rapidly complexity scaled in places like Sumer. At the same time, the Earth was slowly shifting out of the Holocene climatic optimum, a long, relatively warm, and stable climate period that had supported the rise of agriculture. By around 5000 BCE, the climate began to cool and dry in many regions. In the Middle East and Europe, this led to changing rainfall patterns, shortening growing seasons, and triggering new competition for fertile land. Paleoclimatic reconstructions, such as those by Warner et al., 2008 Quaternary Science Reviews, highlight the onset of more variable weather patterns during this phase. The Neolithic lifestyle, farming, herding, building permanent homes, had already taken root in most of Europe, spreading from the Fertile Crescent via Anatolia and the Balkans. But with settled life came something humanity hadn't dealt with before: accumulation. With agriculture came surplus. With surplus came inequality. And with inequality came hierarchy. The communal life of early foragers began to fracture. In its place rose social classes, chiefdoms, inherited power, and along with them, entirely new ways to dominate. And the first signs of what that looked like? We find them in bones. Take Talheim, Germany, a quiet field where archaeologists unearthed a mass grave dating to around 5000 BCE. Dozens of bodies, men, women, and children, buried together, but they didn't die of disease. Their skulls were crushed, their limbs hacked. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Or look at Schoneck Kilianstetten, not far away. Another mass grave, same brutal pattern. Blunt force trauma, systematic executions, deliberate destruction of bodies. Some were kneeling when they died, suggesting they were killed while restrained or surrendering. These findings were documented in Meyer et al. In 2015, PNAS, which argued for a coordinated act of extermination. These weren't anomalies. Sites like Aspern-Schlitz in Austria, Herxheim, and others across Central Europe show similar signs. Communities wiped out in what appears to be coordinated, targeted violence. And critically, many of these sites show signs of gendered killing, with more adult males killed, and women and children missing entirely, perhaps abducted or absorbed. This wasn't just chaos. This was organized, and it wasn't local either. Similar patterns emerge as far east as the Central Asian steppe. It was a wave of bloodshed spreading across continents. Why? Because societies weren't just surviving anymore. They were competing for land, for power, for legacy, and when those stakes rise, violence scales. This is the first time in history we begin to see what might be called total war, where the goal isn't just to win, but to erase. Entire communities slaughtered or absorbed. Entire lineages wiped off the map. And this violence wasn't just the result of desperation or scarcity, it was systemic, embedded in emerging power structures. As soon as land became something to own and pass down, as soon as inheritance took root, male control over territory and reproduction became central. As noted by archaeologist Christian Christiansen in several works, for example, Antiquity in 2014, these early hierarchical societies often centered around male-dominated lineage and martial dominance. We also start seeing symbols of prestige: axes, ornaments, fortified enclosures, things that signaled dominance, not just survival. And with every generation, those symbols became more elaborate, more exclusive. Some researchers argue this period marks the true birth of institutional violence, not the hot-blooded revenge killings of earlier days, but cold, strategic extermination. Pre-planned, scaled up, executed with chilling efficiency. And as new elites rose, the fate of those outside their kin group grew darker. If you weren't part of the winning clan, you were expendable. Or worse, a threat to be removed entirely. The stakes weren't just material, they were existential. And as we'll see next, that wasn't just a metaphor. It literally happened in our genes. Chapter 2. The Genetic Culling. But it's not the graves alone that tell the story. The real smoking gun? It's hidden in the Y-chromosome. Over the past 2 decades, advances in ancient DNA analysis have allowed scientists to map our genetic past with astonishing precision, and what they found around 5,000 years ago shook up everything we thought we knew about male ancestry. Genetic studies published in Nature and Genome Research show something astonishing: a sharp and sudden bottleneck in Y-chromosome diversity. In simple terms, the genetic variation passed from father to son across all men nearly vanished during this period, while mitochondrial DNA, inherited from mothers, stayed relatively stable. Y-chromosomes, inherited through fathers, collapsed. One landmark 2015 study by Posnick et al. Named the Genome Research identified this Y-chromosome bottleneck and linked it to dramatic shifts in social structures rather than environmental or biological causes. The decline didn't result from an actual drop in the number of men, but rather from a collapse in genetic diversity among them. To put it bluntly, the majority of men alive at the time left no descendants. Their bloodlines ended permanently. Another analysis by Carmen et al. In 2015, published in Science, found that Y-chromosome diversity in many parts of the world was reduced by up to 90% between 5000 and 3000 BCE. This was not a localized anomaly. It was a global phenomenon, though it hit especially hard in parts of Eurasia. So what happened? Can't be famine or disease for a very simple reason. These don't discriminate. Famines just kill, mostly within a limited area, and disease could discriminate if sexual dimorphism was very pronounced. But this isn't the case for us, especially 7,000 years ago. Only one possibility is left. It was social. It was violent. It was deliberate. Further work by Zhang et al., published in 2018 in Nature Communications, proposes a compelling explanation. As hierarchical societies and patrilineal clans began to rise, a few dominant male lineages essentially monopolized reproduction. Warfare, conquest, and elite status enabled some men to father many children, while others perhaps the majority, were excluded entirely from the gene pool. The researchers suggest that intense competition among patrilineal groups led to the near erasure of entire Y-chromosome branches, with only a few powerful male lines left standing. These weren't just population dynamics. They were the results of systemic violence and the reshaping of society into structures that prized control over territory, women, and legacy. And the scale of this transformation wasn't subtle. In many regions, just a handful of lineages came to dominate the entire genetic landscape. For example, Y haplogroup R1b spread across much of Western Europe during this period, often associated with steppe migrations and elite warrior cultures like the Yamnaya, and later the bell-beaker phenomenon. In parts of Central and South Asia, haplogroup R1a shows a similar pattern, linked to the spread of Indo-European languages and hierarchical pastoralist societies. Even more striking is the contrast between male and female genetic histories during this time. Mitochondrial DNA studies show far more continuity among women, meaning that while male populations were violently disrupted, women were often absorbed into the conquering groups. This asymmetry is a genetic echo of what likely happened on the ground. Conquest not just of land, but of lineages. This genetic evidence aligns with archaeological findings of gendered violence and selective extermination. It's as if entire male populations were systematically erased and replaced, not just through battlefield death. And unlike natural bottlenecks, which tend to affect both sexes and leave a variety of genetic traces, this one is strikingly selective, targeting only the paternal line. It's a pattern unseen in almost any other species without human intervention. Some have even drawn parallels to the idea of cultural gene drives, a concept where social structures act as a kind of selection mechanism, pushing certain traits or lineages to dominate while suppressing others. In this case, the trait being amplified wasn't just physical strength or fertility, but social access to power. Who got to lead? Who got to mate? Who got remembered? What we see in the genetic record is not just a bottleneck. It's a purge, a coordinated, long-term, and civilization-wide pruning of the male half of humanity's ancestral tree. And this culling reshaped the future in ways we're still only beginning to understand, not just who we came from, but what forms of power became embedded in the very structure of society itself. Chapter 3. Warfare, Power, and Patriarchy. That's the birth of patriarchy. And by that I'm not talking about today's patriarchy. I'm referring to its most violent core and roots. Before this shift, most conflict was localized. Disputes erupted between neighboring bands, usually over hunting territory, foraging rights, or temporary resource scarcity. These were often resolved through feuds, short-term raids, or individual retaliation. But once farming allowed certain families or lineages to accumulate long-term wealth, land, livestock, tools, stored grain, everything changed. Suddenly, violence wasn't just reactive. It became strategic. Welcome to war. Entire male groups began competing against each other for dominance, not just over resources, but over reproduction and legacy. Warfare became a tool not only to expand territory, but to remove rival bloodlines from the equation. This shift also paralleled the rise of prestige-based economies. Societies began valuing displays of martial prowess, with warrior status becoming a pathway to influence and reproductive privilege. In these societies, success in war often translated directly into access to mates and social capital, a pattern still seen in traditional cultures where bride wealth and raiding coexisted as complementary institutions. Anthropological fieldwork, such as that by Napoleon Chagnon among the Yanomami, showed similar dynamics. Men who killed in battle often had more wives and more children, an echo of deep, ancient logic. And when one group defeated another, they didn't just plunder, they erased. Archaeological sites across Europe and Central Asia show repeated patterns. Mass graves dominated by adult males, missing women and children. Destroyed settlements, replaced by new ones bearing different material cultures. This wasn't episodic, it was structural. Women and children might be absorbed into the victor society, a tragic but common pattern seen across both human and primate history. As primatologist Richard Wrangham explains, In The Goodness Paradox, 2019, many species, including chimpanzees, show similar behaviors. Intergroup conflict where males are killed and females are abducted into the winning group. The evolutionary logic is harsh, but consistent. But the men, they were systematically eliminated. This wasn't a one-off massacre. This was a pattern, a deep restructuring of human societies, where victorious male bloodlines multiplied and the vanquished vanished. This kind of genetic and social filtering produced rigid patriarchal structures. Authority passed through the male line, and loyalty to kin groups became paramount. These clans didn't just protect their own, they enforced internal discipline and external aggression. Archaeological finds from fortified hilltop settlements and burial mounds reveal hierarchical arrangements that often centered around a single, powerful patriarch or warrior chieftain, accompanied in death by symbolic displays of dominance, weapons, animals, and sometimes other humans. Elite warrior classes, those with the power to coordinate violence, defend wealth, and project force, became the central reproductive engines of their cultures. Archaeogenetic studies of Yamnaya, corded ware, and bell beaker burial sites, including research synthesized by Hawk et al. In Nature in 2015, revealed dramatic shifts in paternal ancestry, pointing to scenarios where small, elite male groups essentially replaced the previous male population over just a few generations. Some of these elites became almost dynastic in scope. Genetic analysis of ancient remains from Ireland to Kazakhstan suggests that in some regions, a single male lineage could account for a massive percentage of all male descendants over just a few centuries. One striking example is the so-called Genghis Khan effect, a relatively recent case where a single man's Y-DNA lineage is estimated to appear in 1 in 200 men alive today. But this pattern had already emerged long before recorded history, and the genetic echoes of that selective pressure are still visible in our DNA today. When you examine global Y-DNA haplogroups, a few dominant lineages, R1A, R1B, J2, E1B, 1B, stand out as disproportionately successful. Their spread is not just a story of migration, but of conquest, of systems that amplified a few and extinguished the rest. In essence, prehistoric power wasn't just political or military. It was biological. Victory meant not only surviving, but reproducing at scale. And the losers, their names, their stories, their very genes, were erased. This is the foundation of what would become millennia of patriarchal dominance. Not just men in power, but specific men, specific families, specific lineages. This is the birth of noblesse, basically, even by its rules. The monopolization of resources, the right and duty to wage war, the need to have a male heir to perpetuate the dynasty. The legacy of this transformation persists. Modern societies may no longer operate through warbands and raiding parties, but many of our power structures, from dynastic politics to generational wealth, still echo these prehistoric filters, systems that reward domination, defend inherited power, and marginalize the unaligned aren't new. They're ancient, and we're still living with the consequences of those selections today. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Warrior Society. This dramatic Y-chromosome bottleneck coincides with another major transformation in human history, the rise of militarized hierarchies. Around 3000 BCE, across the Eurasian steppe and into Europe, the foundations for a new kind of social order were being laid, one in which status, violence, and legacy were deeply intertwined. The Yamnaya culture, emerging from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, provides one of the clearest examples. These mobile pastoralists buried their dead in kurgans, monumental mounds that didn't just mark graves, but projected power. Their construction alone required organized labor and social coordination, pointing to emerging leadership structures that went far beyond kinship. Excavations detailed in the study by Hawk et al. Published in Nature, 2015 revealed burial sites filled with weapons, wagon parts, and sacrificed animals. These weren't just funerals. They were declarations. The individuals buried here were not ordinary men. They were symbols of authority. And the symbols didn't lie. Genetic evidence confirms that these men had a disproportionate number of descendants. In many parts of Europe, Yamnaya-derived male lineages became dominant, overtaking older local ancestries within a few generations. The graves tell us who ruled. The genes tell us who remained. But this was more than just reproductive success. It was a complete redefinition of what power looked like. Where earlier societies emphasized community and shared labor, the Yamnaya introduced something different. A hierarchy built around warrior prestige. Status was now expressed through control of horses, weapons, mobility, and, crucially, burial treatment. The dead were ranked, and that ranking reflected the living world's structure. We see this most vividly in the organization of cemeteries. Certain men were buried with copper axes and long-distance wagons, while others received almost nothing. A clear indication that these societies recognized and enforced stratification. In some cases, animal sacrifices and elaborate grave constructions may have served as a kind of proto-propaganda, communicating the enduring strength and divine favor of the lineage. These patterns were not isolated. Descendant cultures like the corded ware and bell beaker peoples adopted and refined the formula. Elite graves, prestige goods, inherited status. Over time, the structure became self-reinforcing. Sons of chieftains became chieftains. Prestige flowed through blood. And so emerged the warrior aristocracy, a class not defined by bureaucracy or ritual, but by visible material expressions of dominance. Fortified settlements, ceremonial weapons, and burial displays all worked together to maintain a system where violence and hierarchy fed into each other. This model proved stunningly durable. Variations of it would later appear in Mycenaean Greece, Iron Age Europe, and even early Rome. The core idea, that the right to rule was earned through conquest and inherited through male lineage, was already firmly in place. By crystallizing status around martial success, these societies also created a new kind of masculinity, one where identity, leadership, and even personal worth were tied to the capacity for violence. That idea, arguably born in the mound fields of the steppe, would go on to echo through thousands of years of human culture. And even though the weapons changed, the structure stayed familiar. The glorification of the warrior, the sanctification of elite male lineage, and the belief in inherited power became cornerstones of political life for millennia to come. And it lasted pretty much all the way to 19th century Europe, when democracy shook the ancestral model. But these early burial mounds weren't just ancient cemeteries. They were blueprints. Chapter 5. Myths of a Violent Golden Age. Interestingly, ancient myths seem to echo memories of this violent transition, not as tragedy, but as origin story. Consider the Greek heroic age, described by Hesiod as a time when demigods roamed the earth, fighting wars like those at Thebes and Troy. These heroes were often born of gods and mortals, their tales filled with honor, wrath, and untimely death. A glorified cycle of masculine valor and sacrifice. And yet, beneath the shining bronze and epic poetry, these stories are saturated with themes of extermination, conquest, and the collapse of entire peoples. As Walter Burkert explores in Homo Nicans in 1972, Greek myth and ritual are deeply embedded in sacrificial violence, with heroic narratives serving as echoes of archaic male initiation rites and historic trauma. In Norse mythology, the sagas speak of constant inter-clan warfare, blood feuds, and Ragnarok, the final great battle in which the world is consumed and remade. Again, violence is not just a setting. It is the very engine of destiny, marking the passage from one world to the next. These myths emerged from a warrior culture that celebrated death in battle as the highest honor, a value system built not on peace, but on the selective survival of elite warrior lineages. Across the world, the Hindu epic Mahabharata recounts a colossal war between closely related clans, the Pandavas and Kauravas, in which nearly all the warriors of the known world perish. The aftermath is not celebration, but silence. A desolate earth, stripped of its heroes. And yet even here, the violence is rendered divine, preordained, and ultimately necessary for cosmic balance. These stories are not outliers. Similar themes appear in ancient Irish epics, Mesopotamian legends, and even indigenous American oral traditions, where a previous world is destroyed to make way for the one we live in. In many of them, the world is reset through blood. Comparative mythologists like Michael Witzel, in the Origins of the World's Mythologies of 2012, argue that this recurring narrative pattern, a golden age shattered by cataclysmic conflict, reflects a shared ancestral memory, shaped by real historical and demographic collapses. What these myths may represent is a kind of cultural memory, a distorted, dramatized reflection of the real social upheavals and violent bottlenecks that rewired prehistoric human societies. But instead of mourning the scale of human loss, they encode it as heroism. They transform systemic violence into divine narrative. And perhaps that makes sense, because the ones who wrote the myths, or passed them down, were the survivors, the victors, the bloodlines that endured. It's possible that these legends served more than just entertainment or moral instruction. They may have functioned as tools of cultural consolidation, reinforcing the legitimacy of warrior elites, and naturalizing the violence that had established them. Bruce Lincoln, in Myth, Cosmos, and Society back in 1986, makes a strong case that myths were used across Indo-European cultures to sanctify conquest and male-dominated power structures, linking violence to divine right. After all, if the gods fought and killed to bring order, then surely the ruling classes had the right to do the same. In this way, mythology becomes not just memory, but justification, a sacred echo of the real battles that shaped who we are allowed to remember. A forgotten genocide, reborn as epic. Chapter 6, The Long Shadow. But why does it still matter? Why would a 7,000-year-old massacre have any significance today? Simply put, the systems that took shape during that prehistoric upheaval, patriarchy, stratified violence, male-dominated inheritance, laid the groundwork for much of recorded history. These weren't just temporary adaptations. They hardened into institutions, belief systems, and cultural defaults. Our modern ideas of power, kinship, and gender roles are rooted in that era. The hierarchical models first structured by early warrior societies became the scaffolding for monarchies, empires, and eventually, modern nation-states. As David W. Anthony points out in The Horse, the Wheel, and Language in 2007, the Indo-European expansion didn't just spread languages. It spread a worldview, one where male lineage, inherited status, and conquest became central to identity. The echoes of these systems persist today. In our legal traditions, in family naming systems, even in how we define leadership, paternal surnames, the cultural link between masculinity and control, the valorization of dominance, all are traces of ancient models still acting on the present. They feel natural, inevitable, but they are not. Understanding this history invites us to rethink what we mean by human nature.
I find this aspect of human nature not discussed enough, but it is surely one of the causes of warfare.
Were we always organized this way? Always violent, hierarchical, male-dominated? Or did a specific set of prehistoric conditions lock certain patterns into place? Patterns we now take for granted? Yuval Harari argues in Sapiens, his 2014 bestseller, that what we call human nature is really a collage of cultural adaptations, shaped by stories we've told to justify how we've lived and survived. Sometimes those stories serve to mask the cost. Because the truth is, the genetic winners of the past weren't necessarily the most creative, wise, or compassionate. They were often simply the most violent, best positioned, or luckiest, which raises a haunting question. What possibilities were lost in the bloodshed? What ideas, art forms, languages, and social models disappeared when entire lineages were erased? What alternative futures were preemptively extinguished, not by chance, but by conquest? And what if some of those forgotten paths had offered something radically different, a way of life less centered on domination and legacy, and more on reciprocity, resilience, and care? More recently, anthropologist James C. Scott, in Against the Grain in 2017, shows how early state-building projects didn't just organize society. They also suppressed more egalitarian, mobile, and flexible lifeways. The dominance of rigid, top-down hierarchies wasn't inevitable. It was enforced, and its legacy still shapes our assumptions about what society should be. Which brings us back to the present. If we can recognize how much was lost, we can begin to see what might still be reclaimed. Not by romanticizing the past, but by acknowledging that it wasn't the only way forward. The systems we inherited are not sacred. They're not timeless. They're just old. And once we realize that, we can start imagining alternatives, not by going back, but by refusing to keep going in only one direction, a silence in our blood. So next time you hear the phrase, survival of the fittest, remember, sometimes fitness meant nothing more than being in the right place at the right time, or being born into the right lineage. It didn't always mean wisdom, or kindness, or even strength. Sometimes it simply meant surviving long enough to write the story. And so we inherited a world shaped not by what was best, but by what was left, the dominant myths, the surviving names, the ideas of power passed through millennia like torches, lighting a path we never chose. We didn't ask for that inheritance, but we can choose how to carry it. If this story made you think differently about the past, or the present, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who'd find it meaningful. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and check out our other deep dives into forgotten chapters of human history. Every click helps the echo carry a little further. Until next time, keep listening to the echo.